Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, in particular our patron and former president of the Institute, the Rt Hon Winston Peters, who's here, the minister, obviously, whom I will introduce shortly, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, other heads of mission and members of the Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So, the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs every year holds an annual lecture as a flagship public event for the Institute, delivered every year by a prominent person in international affairs affecting New Zealand. The lecture always follows the annual general meeting of the Institute, which took place a short while ago here in Wellington. You have been invited to listen to the Minister, and I do want to introduce him now, Rt Hon Winston Peters, Minister of Foreign Affairs of New Zealand. Minister, the floor is yours.
Dick Grant, Anand Satyan and Lady Satyan. Before discussing the challenges and opportunities facing New Zealand's foreign policy, we'd like to first acknowledge the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. You have contributed to debates about New Zealand foreign policy over an awfully long period of time, and we thank you for hosting us. Can we also welcome the Dean and members of the Diplomatic Corps? You are critical enablers for advancing your country's interests and ours, and we thank you for your work here in Wellington. As mentioned when we met late last year, the Coalition Government respects each and every one of you as representatives of governments that chart their own independent foreign policy. Distinguished guests, for this evening's speech, we thought to begin at the height of the COVID pandemic of 2020. Shut off from the world and amidst pervasive global uncertainty, we tasked senior officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade to put their minds to the foreign policy challenges that would emerge post-pandemic. It was a useful exercise as it placed our daily conduct of foreign policy at the height of a global crisis into a wider context. It also gave us a sense of how the world would re-emerge post-COVID. The resulting advice alerted us to the heightened foreign policy challenges that would emerge, challenges that have been borne out since. It confirmed worrying trends that if we look even further back, over several decades, become even more disconcerting. Back when First Deputy Prime Minister in the mid-90s, New Zealand benefited from a strategic environment and an international system that was delivering for us and our interests. The world was becoming more open, more democratic, and more free. We enjoyed effective multilateral institutions. There was impetus for trade liberalisation and a liberal-oriented, rules-based system. But these foundations, which underpinned New Zealand's foreign trade and economic policies in decades past, have seismically shifted in the first quarter of the 21st century. Over the past 25 years, we've witnessed a rolling back of democracy, increasingly restrictive market barriers, and an increase, sadly, in conflict. These deteriorating trend lines take us further away from past assumptions about the global environment that New Zealand is operating in. Sadly, these negative trends have only accelerated over the last 3 years. Ignore that bell. The challenges we face are stark, the worst that anyone today working in politics or foreign affairs can remember. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine cast a pall over Europe, causing death, destruction and misery, and food and energy insecurity. Russia's continuing actions are a direct and shocking assault on the rules-based order by a permanent member of the UN Security Council. When recently in Warsaw we met with Ukrainian refugees and were moved by their personal experiences about the war and of the comfort they have felt from the welcoming Polish people. Poland, alongside its NATO partners, underscored to us the Alliance's strong commitment to collective security. Our discussions with counterparts at the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting and in bilateral meetings in Warsaw, Brussels and Stockholm revealed that member states have seriously lifted defence spending and their commitment to respond collectively to Russian aggression. Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO is the result of a serious miscalculation by Russia. It's also a manifestation of two previously long-standing neutral states recognising that collective security is now necessary to face the current security threat. We also have the utter catastrophe that has unfolded in Gaza, a misery caused by both Hamas' monstrous terrorist attacks on 7 October and the now overwhelming nature of Israel's response. We remain deeply concerned that miscalculation by either Israel or Iran could widen the conflict and divert the world's gaze from where it most needs to be: the urgent need for a permanent ceasefire, release of hostages, and the unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. New Zealand and the international community strongly support the current efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to broker an immediate ceasefire in Gaza in exchange for the release of Israeli hostages. Gaza has dominated our discussions with counterparts since coming into office. We have heard a full spectrum of opinions, and the strong message from the international community is for Israel, Iran, and Iranian proxies to pull back from the brink. Our recent statement at the United Nations General Assembly on this subject reflected this widely shared view, as well as our growing impatience because the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is far too urgent, as is the fate of Israeli hostages, for a further cycle of escalation and recrimination. In Egypt, President Gait of the Arab League and Egypt's Foreign Minister Shakri raised with us New Zealand's recognising Palestine statehood. They spoke of this recognition providing a durable pathway to peace in their region. We agree that the international community, and indeed New Zealand, recognising Palestine as a state and admitting it as a full member of the United Nations is historically inevitable. A Palestinian state is an integral part of New Zealand's long-held position in support of a two-state solution, and we view this as a when, not an if question. That said, we don't consider now, in the middle of a current crisis, to be the optimal time to progress the statehood question. De-escalation, a permanent ceasefire, releasing hostages, and relieving the humanitarian crisis are the needs of the moment, and we risk diverting the world's attention and energy away from them if we launch headlong into now a complicated debate about Palestinian statehood. Such a debate could potentially complicate the called-for crisis response, and we and the international community are urging upon all parties in Gaza that this matter be treated with the greatest of urgency. Closer to home in the Indo-Pacific, we confront the situation of North Korea, its emerging nuclear capability in flagrant breach of international law and UN resolutions. Its aggressive rhetoric and escalating ballistic missile tests directly attack the rules-based order. We are also concerned by North Korea, Iran and China supplying military-related technologies to Russia or supporting its industries to fuel its illegal invasion of Ukraine. No responsible international citizen should be helping Russia to invade and retain another country's sovereign territory. Looking southwards, with 80% of our annual exports to the Indo-Pacific region and over 1/3 of all global shipping transiting the South China Sea, safe navigation is of critical importance for our trade-dependent country. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides the legal basis for managing overlapping claims of sovereignty. And so the tensions we see there are another example of the rule of law and maritime security being recklessly and unnecessarily challenged. The blue continent, of which New Zealand and our Pacific Island family and neighbours are an integral part, also faces more sustained strategic competition and challenges than at any time during the past 80 years. Some island nations also face an existential threat from climate change. The Pacific region's strategic environment is not benign. Far from it. Remorseless pressure is being exerted across it as beachheads are sought and influence peddled. Overall, we see three big shifts in the international order. From rules to power. A shift towards a multipolar world that is characterized by more contested rules and where the relative power between states assumes a greater role in shaping international affairs. And then, from economics to security, a shift in which economic relationships are reassessed in light of increased military competition in a more securitized and less stable world. And from efficiency to resilience, where we see a shift in the drivers of economic behaviour, and where building greater resilience and addressing pressing social and sustainability issues become more prominent. The shifting ground presents challenges for New Zealand. They also reveal the truism that the global geostrategic and security challenges faced in one era or in one form of time do not remain static. 80 years ago, New Zealanders were scattered around the globe fighting the second of two ruinous world wars. 40 years ago, we had started to see the emergence of a freer, richer, more democratic world, in which far more peoples had a direct say over how their societies were run. Now the world in 2024 is different to either 1944 or 1984, and geostrategic theories and foreign policy fundamentals conceived in the 1980s look as outdated to the leaders of today as those of 1944 would have looked in 1984. The world has changed, and so must we. Indeed, each generation of decision-makers confronts new challenges as economics, demographics, technologies, and societies evolve, as do the power calculations that accompany disruptive change. Benign becomes malign. Old truths give way to new ones. The trick now, as it was then, is to have one's eyes wide open about the fundamental shifts that are taking place and be nimble enough in government and through government support systems to adapt to them. Turning now to the opportunities we see. After 3 years of foreign policy incoherence and concerted drift under Labour, our Cabinet endorsed early in its term a foreign policy reset that would reinvigorate and focus our foreign, defence and trade policy agendas. We have since become in the government pursued with vigour a foreign policy that significantly increases its focus on and resources applied to Southeast Asia and India, that re-engages and reinvigorates our relationships with traditional and like-minded partners, that sustains our deep focus on the Pacific and re-energises the 2018 Pacific Reset by working with Pacific leaders and through the Pacific Islands Forum to bolster development and security cooperation across the Pacific. It's a foreign policy that targets multilateral engagement to global or transboundary issues where we have direct interests or where core New Zealand values and freedoms are at stake. That navigates impasses or blockages in the multilateral system to support new groupings of like-minded partners that can more efficiently advance and defend our interests and capabilities. It's a change that promotes the coalition government's goal of effecting a serious step change in export value over the next decade through active economic diplomacy to fuel economic growth. To achieve this ambitious agenda, we knew we needed to give more energy, more urgency, and a sharper focus to three interconnected lines of effort: investing in our relationships, growing our prosperity, and strengthening our security. We have, from day one, hit the ground running because we had a lot of ground to make up. We wanted New Zealand's voice to be heard by the world again. And during the first 5 months of this term as Foreign Minister, we visited 14 countries and engaged with over 60 at home and abroad, covering the vast majority of New Zealand's export markets and its diplomatic partnerships. This engagement as Foreign Minister has supported the similarly vigorous programs of engagement conducted by the Prime Minister, Minister for Trade, Honourable Todd McClay, and Minister of Defence, Honourable Judith Collins, and several other Cabinet colleagues. We are prosecuting with vigour and a real sense of urgency our foreign policy reset because we want to place New Zealanders in the best possible position to achieve the prosperity and security we all aspire to. These engagements, however, do not represent activity for activity's sake. Rather, this broad pattern of engagement allows us to better understand regional and global challenges and crises from multiple perspectives. The war in Ukraine and the catastrophic situation in Gaza are two cases in point, and they have certainly been a strong feature of our foreign policy discussions over the past 5 months. We've also heard loud and clear from our nearest friends in the Pacific their climate, economic and security concerns. In March, we were delighted to host China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. An innately complex relationship, we celebrated with China 10 years since the bilateral relationship was elevated to a comprehensive strategic relationship. With tariff-free access for our dairy products into China secured, our economic relationship continues to flourish. We welcomed the positive and frank discussions we had with Wang Yi, both on issues we agreed on and those we did not, and look forward to further engagement with China this year and over the term. Through our vigorous diplomatic engagement, we have shown traditional and like-minded partners and those who New Zealand has neglected for far too long, such as, for example, Latin America, that New Zealand government is back internationally and ready to forge more active, more mutually advantageous relationships. Our strategy is simple. Given the golden age of trade liberalisation has passed, the Coalition Government is committed to making incremental trade and economic gains and creating economic opportunities, large or small, everywhere we possibly can. We believe these will, over time, add up and allow our exporters to grow their existing markets while also diversifying into new ones. As we move our initial focus on action and re-engagement to creating more opportunities for export growth and economic outcomes, there are some lessons learned from the first phase of our foreign policy reset. And it comes down to this: small states matter. Our meeting with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres confirmed that small states like New Zealand do matter. We are, for instance, highly respected by the United Nations leadership for our long-held and consistent opposition to the use of the Security Council veto. New Zealand is thus well placed to assist the UN with any future reform of the Security Council and its veto powers, reforms that are sorely needed. Our positive reception in New York reinforced the equal respect in which nations are held. We are all equals, a first principle that drives the conduct of this government's foreign policy with nations, big and small. Fundamentally, New Zealand is respected because of its values and the consistent expression of them across governments and over time. But this reputational capital has to be nurtured by each fresh generation of decision makers. We cannot rest on our laurels. A second lesson from our first 5 months of international engagement is, and to emphasise an earlier point, that global and regional security has never been more important. Here, New Zealand needs to ask hard questions of itself. As we seek a more secure region and world, are we doing our share? Across Europe, in Southeast Asia and across Pacific Rim countries, nations are stepping up to play their part in defence arrangements. So must we, because it is a key metric of how others judge us, a point made clear repeatedly during our first 5 months of engagements. New Zealand's long history of parsimony when it comes to defence cannot hold if we wish to continue garnering respect from and influence on others. As a number of traditional and like-minded partners have accentuated to us in these troubled times, contributing to global and regional security is not a luxury, it's a necessity given the number and severity of challenges faced across the Indo-Pacific, Europe and the Middle East. Third, diplomacy matters. At this moment in time, the ability to talk with, rather than at, each other has never been more needed. Our program of engagements reinforces that those who share our values, and even those who do not, gain from understanding each other's position, even when we cannot agree. From understanding comes opportunity, and from diplomacy comes compromise, the building block of better relations between nations. We need more diplomacy, more engagement, more compromise, and none of those words are cliches. The next step in the pursuit of our foreign policy goals is to maintain urgency while becoming forensic about where we can achieve the best gains in terms of enhancing both our security and prosperity. Supporting this effort will require whole-of-government leadership to follow through on promises and commitments made. It should be noted that the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Ministry of Defence and the New Zealand Defence Force are all in various stages of leadership transition. Once bedded in, new leadership across these core parts of our national security system will help better align responsiveness and capability with the expectations and goals of the coalition government. There is much work to do, and with new stable leadership soon in place, we will be better able to deliver. And now we turn to the confused public debate around AUKUS Pillar 2. There's been much said about New Zealand's possible involvement, so let's begin by laying out some very basic facts. Discussions amongst officials began in September 2021, and the first advice from officials to ministers about the potential for New Zealand to associate with AUKUS began in October of 2021. In 2023, almost 2 years after and during careful consideration, Labour's Prime Minister, in concert with his Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence, sanctioned officials to begin discussions with AUKUS partners about Pillar 2's scope and architecture. Exploratory information gathering discussions in Canberra, London and Washington did not spontaneously occur. Officials were mandated to conduct them by the Labour government. That choice was consistent with former Prime Minister Hipkin's statement last year that, and I quote him, "Our region is now a strategic theatre," end of quotes. It was also consistent with New Zealand's nuclear-free legislation, which all of our significant political parties in this country continue to support. So let's be clear. Pillar 2 discussions were initiated by Labor before the current coalition government was voted into office. That is why we state we are continuing a process already begun by our predecessor, Labor government. Second, there is one crucial precondition and one consequential decision required before New Zealand could or would participate in Pillar 2. The precondition is that AUKUS partners need to want us to participate in Pillar 2 and to invite us to do so. That precondition has not yet been met, which is why we are exploring with our traditional partners the scope of Pillar 2 and seeking a much more detailed understanding of what this involves. Indeed, it's not yet fully clear to us what criteria AUKUS partners will use when considering the participation of new countries in Pillar 2. This government, like its predecessor, has its ministers and officials seeking information and in discussions with their counterparts so that we can better understand what opportunities and benefits Pillar 2's advanced technologies may offer New Zealand. We must also carefully examine what utilities, if any, we might offer or be expected to offer Pillar 2 partners in return. That, although it sounds obvious, will take some time. The consequential decision, if the precondition of being invited to participate in Pillar 2 is met sometime in the future, is New Zealand would then need to want to do so. And that future point we will need to carefully weigh up, at that particular point, the economic and security benefits and costs of any decision about whether participating in Pillar 2 is in the national interest. The government is a long way from this point of being able to make such a decision. But we should emphasise that it would be utterly irresponsible for any government of any stripe to not consider whether collaborating with like-minded partners on advances in technology is in our national interest. We have equities with our one formal ally, Australia. That means we need to understand what the Pillar 2 architecture means for our closest defence and indeed diplomatic relationship. For instance, if Australia adopts new advanced technologies, what does that mean for New Zealand's ability to communicate with our allies' capabilities? It would be irresponsible for us not to consider whether the $3.5 billion of taxpayer money which former Minister of Defence Ron Mark and we secured in 2018 to purchase 4 P-8A Poseidon aircraft and replace our antiquated Hercules fleet with 5 new Hercules aircraft will still be fit for purpose under Pillar 2's technology advances. Prudence also dictates exploring technological advancement to assess its potential significant benefits for our economy, military and space sectors, and how these benefits might then flow into wider society. That is why former Prime Minister Chris Hipkins and his Cabinet colleagues were open to exploring Pillar 2's opportunities. Now it seems, though, not so much. Openness in government is transforming before our eyes into close-mindedness in opposition. We are disquieted by any potential breakdown in foreign policy by partisanship over Pillar 2. Bipartisanship in foreign policy is not a luxury for a small state. It's a necessity. It's a necessary condition for advancing our sovereign interests effectively, thereby keeping New Zealanders secure and prosperous. And we therefore urge them to hold their nerve. We also believe, given our information gathering is still in its early stages, that critics and commentators are well ahead of where the government presently sits in relation to Pillar 2. And we have listened to those critics who reject Pillar 2 outright, before even being in possession of the most basic facts. Look, they're entitled to their view, but we are also entitled to challenge their reasoning. Critics also possess a luxury that we do not. They can paint the darkest picture of Pillar 2 and make ignorant assertions about the nature of the strategic environment, liberated by not knowing what they just don't know. The coalition government, in contrast, is constrained in its ability to properly respond to such ignorance because of what we do know, but can't say to safeguard the conduct of our foreign policy. Thus, while rhetoric about New Zealand acquiring hypersonic weaponry and New Zealand facing no threats to its security are repeated by journalists and commentators who should better appreciate this fundamental information imbalance. Pillar 2 is not a military alliance, but a technology sharing mechanism being developed by three of our closest traditional security partners. It's being developed as a response to a deteriorating strategic environment. It seeks to strengthen defence capabilities, deter coercion or aggression in our region, and support security and stability. And let's also be clear about which governments comprise Pillar 2. Three of our closest friends on the international stage. Indeed, Pillar 1 partners comprise a US government led by Democratic Party Joe Biden, a Labour-led Australian government, and a Conservative government in the United Kingdom supported by the Labour opposition. These are the countries that opponents of Pillar 2 are scaremongering about. Critics claiming New Zealand and the region face no security threats also ignore any number of reports and statements. Like the Defence Policy and Strategic Statement and National Security Strategy, or attribution statements about foreign interference, published under successive New Zealand governments about specific and wider security threats. The critics also seriously impugn those agencies and the dedicated people who work in them, collecting and analysing intelligence about the security challenges our country and region and the wider world face. Now, intelligence is never perfect. We know that, which is why ministers take responsibility for making decisions on foreign and defence policy on matters of national security. By example, there was a massive intelligence failure in the early 2000s, one which prompted a former New Zealand Prime Minister to declare the country existed in an, and I quote, incredibly benign strategic environment, end of quotes, even as planning was well advanced for the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. We also note that full intelligence sharing with the United States only resumed in 2009. The critics are sadly out of date. They should respect whether it was the last Labour government or the current coalition government that we take our security responsibility as seriously as they once did. There's also, we believe, an ideological element underpinning the critics' outright rejection of Pillar 2 and their claim that we are abandoning an independent foreign policy. Their conception of our independent foreign policy has always carried a strand of anti-Americanism. So being independent means for them saying no to the United States. There's an old saying that nostalgia is the most seductive of liars. We think some of the critics are seduced by old battles and projecting those onto the Pillar 2 debate. But they ignore, consciously or otherwise, the fact that we now exist in a qualitatively new and different economic and security environment from years past. We also say that if independence for our country's foreign policy means something, disagreeing with our traditional and like-minded partners, but somehow does not involve also being at liberty to agree with them at times to pursue shared mutual interests, then the term independence is utterly meaningless. New Zealand independent foreign policy does not, and never has, meant we are a non-aligned nation although that is the way some critics in politics and the media see it. We have always had our foreign policy alignments. We picked sides in the 2 world wars of the 20th century. We have a military alliance with Australia. We have an intelligence partnership with our 4 other Western English-speaking countries. We have defence arrangements with a number of Southeast Asian partners. We build coalitions of interest across any number of issues. For New Zealand to be independent is not to be neutral or non-aligned. Independence is about having the agency to freely make decisions in any direction, consistent with well-considered and prudent assessments of New Zealand's vital national interests. Finally, critics of our foreign policy argue that there has been a dramatic shift since the change of government. In this, we do agree with them. We have shifted from drift to re-engagement, from inertia to action. We have shifted from lethargy to energy, from incoherence to coherence. We take the world as it is, and this realism is a shift from our predecessors' vaguer notions of an Indigenous foreign policy that no one else understood, let alone shared. And by the way, when you're travelling overseas, you find a lot of people are Indigenous. There's nothing unique about it. The threats New Zealand faces, outlined this evening, are incredibly challenging. But the government sees opportunity too, and we will continue to pursue each of them with vigour and commitment. However, we are steadfast in our belief that New Zealand's voice matters, that within the community of nations we stand as equals, and that more than ever, diplomacy matters. Thank you.
We've got about 10 to 15 minutes of question time. The Minister is happy to take them, so I call for questions. Gentleman down the back with his hand.
Because the New Zealand recently is one of the observers in the recent concluded Philippine-United States military exercises. So I was just wondering whether is this a form of assurances, because we all know that the United States is going to be conducting its election this year. So does that mean that the New Zealand government, this government is anxious about the result of the United States election, so that's why it decided to join the Philippine and the United States military alliance as an observer?
We have been doing that for over 40 years under successive governments, Labor and National. And on the other issue, everybody's watching very carefully the American elections. But I'm in foreign affairs, so it's not my job to comment on what I think about them.
Thank you. Next question, gentleman in the middle row here.
Thank you very much, Minister. My name is Brett Longley. I'm wondering, you mentioned in your address some of the countries that are currently presenting some severe threats. But I'm wondering about countries which are not immediately threatening but could be of considerable benefit, but in a way it's yet unclear. And I'm thinking particularly of India. And I'm wondering here if you have any comments about how you see New Zealand's relationship with India evolving. Thank you.
Can I say, sir, that having watched over the years this relationship, to be frank, it's been one, from our perspective, of disappointment, because we haven't made the progress that we should have. And I think that one of the primary reasons for that is that personal relationships matter big time in India and a lot of other countries like that. I can recall it's 1985, and Mike Moore's coming back from India leading a trade delegation, and the big headlines that he had secured $500 million of potential orders. You like that phrase? Potential orders. We've been doing that for far too long, and now it's real. We're going to put the spade work in and the work in and be more focused at the ground level where we can make progress. Some have talked about a free trade deal. If you ask me personally, it is going from one deal to the other, till one day you put something together, it's going to change our economic outcomes with India. That goes to a lot of other countries as well. And that's why we've already been there and we're going back again, and we'll keep on going back, hopefully without criticising anybody, with an approach that pays off to the benefit of both of our countries. They're so large in population, and now it's not so big. But I think it can be done.
Thank you, Dr. Lau, member of the Institute. On US-China relations, Dr. Kissinger said in 2023, quote unquote, "We should never require China to act like we do. China should not expect us to act like China does. We each develop our society in ways that we think most appropriate. We progress side by side, but not necessarily to the same music." My question, Mr. Peters, would you agree that New Zealand and the world will be better off if we follow Dr. Kissinger's peaceful, win-win approach to US-China relations? Thank you.
Sir, I've met Henry Kissinger. Second thing I want to say is, he said a whole lot more than that, not just what you said. But I do respect his experience and his knowledge. I do also respect the fact that when we look at China, it has not survived millennium after millennium because they're not very clever, not brilliant thinkers. I observed over the years that some people have not had that in their mind or understood that. But that's not a mistake that I intend to make, because I have a serious respect for China for a whole lot of reasons, including their recent successes economically. But because 5,000 years ago in our DNA we left from there, some of us.
I was just wanting to ask about how in today's world of very complex, sophisticated supply chains, we're seeing that sanctions are being undermined, especially in North Korea and Russia. I think there's a study released today that Japan and South Korea have been contributing a fractional portion of raw materials to Russia's war industry, despite them not knowing that. How do you and the wider international community see about trying to design sanctions to target supply chains? Thank you.
You're rightly to point out it's very complicated trying to find out exactly what is going on in every area. I learned today, for example, that amongst other things, refrigerators are being rather heavily purchased in Kazakhstan, not because people need refrigeration, but because the electric discs in them can be used for military purposes. And those sort of strange variations on what looks like a sincere and honest trade deal can happen. It's awfully complicated. And it's one of the reasons why we need to share information from all sorts of people, which information can help us. But you're quite right. Supply chains are very uncertain in that context, and the best thing we can do is be on red alert.
Thank you very much, Minister. Jody here. Just got a question about relationships with the African continent. We hear a lot about Europe, Asia, North America, the Pacific, but we don't hear much about the African continent. I'm just wondering what the New Zealand government's view is on building relationships with the African continent and advancing them.
Look, thank you for your question. And you're right to put that there, but can I just say that we are way out here in the West Pacific, just north of the Penguins. Everything is a long, long way away, and where resources are strung out, and dare I say it, and it's a public thesis that I've announced anyway, so it's not a betrayal of my coalition colleagues, but I've always said for years that we've not spent near enough money in foreign affairs and trade. I've said it for a long, long time now, and I believe that we've got to keep on pressing on, trying harder to lift our game, so to speak, and be in more countries. And Africa is definitely a part of it. We are in some parts, but not as nearly as many as perhaps you would like. But as I say, this is a country that's facing a recession, on the edge of one, and we're quite right now, the major priorities are turn it around and not the expenditure of money. However, there is a collateral to that, and that is that a greater investment in foreign affairs and trade, I'm not making a plea to the Foreign Minister, to the Finance Minister right now, would be one of the key things that I personally would do if I was in that job.
I have time for one more question. So I think there's a gentleman at the back with his hand up.
Hi, I'm To. I'm a student from Thailand. I just wonder, a couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister went to visit Southeast Asia, Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines. And I just wonder how ASEAN and Thailand can create the prosperity and peace for the world, and especially, as you said, for the economic diplomacy for the prosperity of New Zealand. Yep. Thank you.
Well, you've asked me to speak on behalf of ASEAN. In that context, let me say this, that ASEAN's an extraordinarily positive influence. And one of the sort of major sort of unheralded features of Asian diplomacy is they don't do it through the newspapers. And they don't do it through loudspeakers. They do it quietly. If you want to find out, you're more likely to find out where there's no recording devices. And then you feel what people really think and feel. That I believe that ASEAN is going to be critically important in a peaceful future going forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I apologise for the start, but I never did expect to see a protest about a meeting of this institute, if I might say. And I want to know, how on earth did you get in the room?
You stay there.
Okay, yeah. Which one? That one will do.
Distinguished guests, good evening. E tēnā koutou I te pō. As patron of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, it falls to me to deliver concluding remarks and a vote of thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Right Honourable Winston Peters. The brief I have is a matter of duty as well as delight, because you and I, Minister, have known each other for a long time, since we were law students at the same time at the University of Auckland a great many years ago. And every so often, our paths continue to cross with our involvement in official capacities, but it has now reached a stage where the legendary memory of the notional historian is sorely tested. As you have made clear this evening, Minister, these are perilous times globally. It makes the mission of securing an independent foreign policy one of working out how best to meet challenges of a strategic kind and all-abiding pursuit. I will not be the only person who will remember your three phrases partway through your speech: rules to power, economics to security, and efficiency to resilience. The same kind of stream applies to the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, now approaching its 90th year of existence. Also, importantly, as an independent civil society organisation that fosters understanding of international affairs as they relate to our country. With this in mind, we are exceedingly grateful to you, Minister, for making the time to deliver the Institute's annual lecture this evening and for fielding questions so generously. It is clear that you have had an exceedingly busy travel schedule in maintaining your office in the past recent months. Since the general election, it seems clear from what you have said and prioritised that the country has benefited from some of the insights you have gained on the missions you have conducted and reported on this evening. There are also briefly some other acknowledgements to be made. I'd like to thank, on behalf of the Institute, the Speaker of the House, the Right Honourable Jerry Brownlee, for his approval for the Institute to use Parliament's facilities this evening. Can I also thank the NZIIA staff who worked with the Minister's Office and staff from Parliament and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade to make this evening a success. Further thanks are due to you, Dr. Grant, National Chair of the NZIIA, for your chairing and moderating this evening. Finally, can I thank everyone for coming, including ministers, members of Parliament, senior officials, Your Excellencies, heads of mission, and members of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. We appreciate you being here and hope that you will stay engaged with the Institute in the future. You are all warmly invited to continue discussion at a drinks and things to accompany drinks occasion in the Grand Hall at the rear of this chamber immediately afterwards. But before I ask you to disperse, can I ask you please to join me in suitably sustained applause thanking the Minister. Au mai te paki paki.